The restaurant looked like a place where only the most important people in the city came to spend their evenings. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, reflecting off polished glass and shining silverware. Every table was carefully arranged, and the quiet sound of gentle music floated through the air, making everything feel calm and expensive at the same time. People spoke in low voices, dressed in fine clothes, laughing softly as they enjoyed meals that cost more than what some people earned in days. For most of the guests, it was just another night. But for one person moving quietly between the tables, it was simply work. Hannah carried a tray with steady hands, her steps light and careful as she made her way through the room. She had learned how to move without drawing attention, how to be present but almost invisible. Her uniform was neat, her hair tied back simply, and her expression always polite. When guests spoke to her, she answered with a small smile and respectful tone. Never too much, never too little. She knew exactly how to behave in a place like this. It wasn't something she had always known, but something she had learned over time. She placed a glass gently on a table and nodded as the guest thanked her without really looking at her. It was normal. People here didn't pay much attention to those who served them. Hannah didn't mind. She had grown used to it. In fact, she preferred it that way. Being unnoticed meant she could focus on her work, finish her shift, and go home quietly. But even as she moved from table to table, there was one thing she could never ignore: the piano. It stood near the center of the restaurant, shining under a soft spotlight. It wasn't just any piano. It was grand and beautiful, its black surface smooth and perfect, like it had never been touched by anything but care. Every evening, a pianist would sit there and play soft melodies that filled the room. The music wasn't loud, but it was always there, wrapping around the conversations and making everything feel complete. Tonight, the pianist was already playing when Hannah started her shift. The melody was slow and gentle, something that made people relax without even realizing it. As Hannah passed by with another tray, she slowed down just a little. Her eyes moved toward the piano, almost without thinking. For a brief moment, her usual calm expression changed. It was so slight that no one noticed, but inside, something stirred. The sound of the keys, the way the notes rose and fell, it felt familiar. Too familiar. She quickly looked away and continued walking. Hannah had learned long ago not to linger on such things. Memories had a way of making life harder, and she didn't have time for that. She had responsibilities, bills to pay, and a routine she couldn't break. Thinking about the past didn't change anything. Still, the music followed her as she worked. Each note seemed to reach her, even when she tried to focus on orders and tables. It slipped into her thoughts, soft but persistent, like a voice she couldn't fully silence. She kept her face calm, her movements steady, but inside, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She remembered a different room, much smaller than this one. A simple piano stood by a window, with sunlight falling across the keys. She remembered sitting there, her fingers pressing down gently, learning each note one by one. Back then, music had been more than just sound. It had been her world. Hannah! The voice of the manager pulled her back to the present. She turned quickly. Yes. Table 7 is waiting, he said, his tone firm but not harsh. Stay focused. She nodded. Sorry. He walked away, already busy with something else. Hannah took a small breath and moved toward the table. She couldn't afford to lose focus. Not here. Not now. As the night continued, the restaurant grew busier. More guests arrived, filling the room with quiet conversations and soft laughter. Plates came and went, glasses were refilled, and the rhythm of the evening carried on without pause. Hannah worked through it all with practiced ease, never missing a step. But every time she passed near the piano, her eyes would drift toward it, even if just for a second. The pianist played confidently, his fingers moving quickly and smoothly. The guests seemed pleased, though most of them didn't pay full attention. For them, the music was just part of the experience, something expected in a place like this. For Hannah, it was something else entirely. At one point, she paused near the side of the room, waiting for a signal from the kitchen. The music shifted into a slightly more emotional piece, the kind that carried a deeper feeling. Hannah stood still, listening without meaning to. Her fingers moved slightly at her side, as if remembering something. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it felt real to her. Like her body hadn't forgotten what her mind tried to leave behind. She quickly clenched her hand and looked away. There was no point thinking about it. That part of her life was over. It had been over for years. Life hadn't given her a choice. Back then, things had been different. She had time to practice, to learn, to dream. People had believed in her, told her she had talent, that she could go far. She had believed it too. But dreams didn't always survive reality. When her family needed help, when things became difficult, she had made a decision. It hadn't felt like a choice at the time. It had felt like something she had to do. She had stopped playing. At first, she told herself it was temporary. Just until things got better. Just until she could return. But time passed and life moved forward. The piano became something distant. Something she didn't allow herself to think about too much. Until now. The sound of the music in the restaurant made it impossible to forget completely. "Hannah, can you take this?" Another waitress asked, handing her a tray. "Of course," she replied, forcing a small smile. She continued working, pushing the thoughts away again. The night slowly moved forward, and the clock edged closer to the busiest hours. The restaurant was nearly full now, with every table occupied. The energy in the room had shifted slightly, becoming more lively, though still controlled and refined. Hannah moved through it all like she always did, quiet, careful, reliable. Yet something about tonight felt different. She couldn't explain it, but there was a strange feeling in the air. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, it made her more aware of everything around her. As she passed by the piano again, she noticed something. The pianist looked slightly uneasy. It was subtle, but Hannah could see it. His movements weren't as smooth as before, and he glanced toward the entrance more than once. It was as if he was distracted, or worried about something. Hannah slowed down just a little, watching for a moment before continuing on. She didn't think much of it at first. Everyone had off moments, even professionals. Still, the feeling stayed with her. As the evening continued, the music carried on. The guests remained unaware, and the restaurant kept its perfect image. But somewhere beneath that polished surface, something was beginning to shift. Hannah didn't know it yet, but this ordinary night, one that started like so many others, was slowly moving toward a moment that would change everything for her. For now, she was still just a waitress, moving quietly through a room full of people who didn't know her story. But the piano was still there, and so was the part of her that had never truly let it go. The night continued to move forward, but the small uneasiness Hannah had noticed earlier did not go away. The restaurant was now completely full, and the soft glow of the lights mixed with the quiet sound of voices created the usual calm atmosphere. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Guests smiled, glasses clinked gently, and the music flowed like it always did. But behind that smooth surface, things were starting to feel slightly off. Hannah carried a tray of drinks toward one of the larger tables near the window. The guests there were dressed in expensive suits, their voices low but confident as they spoke about business and travel. She placed each glass carefully, making sure not to disturb their conversation. As always, no one paid much attention to her. It was just another part of her job. But just as she turned to leave, the music behind her suddenly faltered. It was only for a second. A small break in the melody, almost like a misstep. Most people didn't notice, but Hannah did. She paused slightly, her body reacting before her mind could even think. Slowly, she turned her head toward the piano. The pianist quickly continued playing, covering the mistake as best as he could. The melody returned, but something was different now. The smooth confidence from earlier was gone. In its place was a slight tension, something uneven that could be felt even if it couldn't be clearly heard. Hannah watched for a moment, her eyes focused. Then she moved on again. She told herself it was nothing. Everyone made mistakes. Even skilled players had moments like that. Still, She couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, she found herself near the service station, organizing plates with another worker named Sora. Sora was quick and cheerful, always talking whenever there was a small break. "Busy night," Sora said, stacking glasses. "Feels like everyone important came today." Hannah gave a small nod. "It does." Sora leaned slightly closer. "Did you see table 3? I think that man is some big company owner. The manager has been checking on them every 5 minutes." Hannah glanced toward the table briefly. "Maybe. You don't care about these things at all, do you?" Sora smiled. Hannah shook her head softly. "Not really." Before Sora could reply, the music shifted again, this time more noticeably. The melody slowed down suddenly, then stopped. The entire room felt it. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they grew quieter. A few people turned their heads toward the piano, confused. The silence lasted only a moment, but in a place like this, even a moment was too long. Hannah looked over quickly. The pianist had stopped playing. His hands hovered over the keys, but he wasn't moving. His face looked pale, and there was a tightness in his expression that hadn't been there before. The manager noticed immediately. He walked quickly toward the piano, trying to keep his movements calm so he wouldn't draw too much attention. Hannah watched as he leaned down and spoke quietly to the pianist. From where she stood, she couldn't hear the words, but she could see the worry in the manager's face. The pianist shook his head slightly. Something was wrong. Sora whispered, "That's not good." Hannah didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the scene. After a short moment, the manager straightened up and forced a polite smile as he looked around the room. He gave a small nod, as if everything was under control, but it was clear that it wasn't. The music didn't start again. The silence began to stretch, and now more guests were noticing. Some looked mildly annoyed, others simply curious. In a place like this, everything was expected to run perfectly. Even a small problem could stand out. The manager walked quickly back toward the staff area, his calm expression fading the moment he turned away from the guests. "Where is the backup?" he asked in a low but urgent voice. One of the staff members shook their head. "He's not here yet. There's traffic," he said. "He'll be late." "How late?" the manager pressed. "No clear time." The manager ran a hand through his hair, clearly stressed now. "We can't have silence. Not tonight." Hannah stood nearby, holding an empty tray, listening without meaning to. Her heart began to beat a little faster, though she didn't fully understand why. "We need someone," the manager said. "Even simple background music will do." "But who?" another worker asked. No one had an answer. The room behind them continued to hum with quiet conversations, but the missing music had changed the feeling. It wasn't as warm anymore. Something felt incomplete. Hannah glanced toward the piano again, stood there still and waiting. For a moment, everything around her seemed to fade slightly. The voices, the movement, even the lights, it all felt distant. Her focus stayed on that one place. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. A thought came to her, sudden and unexpected. She pushed it away immediately. No, it wasn't possible. She hadn't played in years. Not properly. Not in front of people. And certainly not here in a place like this. She looked down, taking a slow breath. But the silence in the room pressed against her again. The manager spoke once more, his voice sharper now. "We don't have time. We need someone now." There was a pause. Hannah felt her heart beating louder. Before she could stop herself, she took a small step forward. "I can play." The words left her mouth quietly, but in that moment, they felt louder than anything else. The manager turned to look at her. For a second, he said nothing. His expression showed clear doubt, almost disbelief. "You?" he asked. Hannah nodded once, though she could feel her hands growing slightly cold. "Just simple music, until someone else comes." The manager looked at her uniform, then back at her face. "You're a waitress," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "I know," she replied softly. There was another pause. Time felt slow, stretched between that moment and the next. Behind them, the silence in the restaurant continued to grow more noticeable. The manager looked around, then back at Hannah again. "You can actually play?" he asked. Hannah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then she nodded again. Yes, it wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the full truth. The manager exhaled slowly, clearly unsure. He glanced toward the dining area, then toward the empty piano. They didn't have many options. "Fine," he said at last. "Just keep it soft. Nothing complicated." Hannah felt a small shift inside her. Something between fear and something else she couldn't name. "Okay," she said. Sora looked at her with wide eyes. "You never told me this." Hannah gave a faint, nervous smile. "It never came up." The manager gestured toward the piano. "Go." Hannah set her tray down carefully. For a moment she didn't move. Then she took her first step. Each step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. The distance wasn't far, but it felt long. The sound of her own footsteps seemed louder in her ears, even though they were soft. Some guests began to notice her. A few glanced at each other, confused. A waitress walking toward the piano was not something they expected. Hannah kept her eyes forward. Her heart was beating fast now, and her hands felt slightly unsteady. She tried to control her breathing to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. When she finally reached the piano, she stopped for a moment. Up close, it looked even more beautiful. The polished surface reflected the soft lights above, and the keys lay in perfect order, waiting for her. She slowly sat down on the bench. For a brief second, she didn't move at all. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, not touching them yet. Memories rushed back all at once. The small room, the sunlight, the quiet hours of practice, the sound of each note as she learned and improved. It had been so long, too long. A small doubt crept into her mind. What if she couldn't do it? What if she made a mistake? What if everyone noticed? She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she took a slow breath. When she opened her eyes again, her expression had changed, just slightly. The fear was still there, but something else was there too, something stronger. Her fingers lowered gently onto the keys. The room waited even if it didn't realize it yet. And then, she pressed the first note. The first note was soft, almost too soft to notice. It slipped into the quiet space of the restaurant like a small ripple on still water. For a brief moment, nothing changed. A few guests continued their conversations, glasses were lifted, and cutlery touched plates with gentle sounds. But then the second note followed, and then another, forming a simple melody that began to stretch through the room. Hannah kept her eyes on the keys. Her fingers moved slowly at first, careful and controlled, as if she was testing something fragile. It had been years since she last sat in front of a piano like this. Her heart was still beating fast, and she could feel the weight of the room behind her. Even though she wasn't looking at anyone, she focused only on the music. The melody was simple, just like she had promised. Nothing complicated, nothing that would draw too much attention. But even in its simplicity, there was something real in the way she played. Each note was clear, steady, and full of quiet feeling. At one of the tables near the center, a man paused mid-sentence. He tilted his head slightly, listening without fully realizing it. The tone of the music was different from before. It wasn't as polished, not as perfect in a technical way, but it carried something else, something warmer. Hannah's fingers continued to move. With each passing second, her hands began to feel more familiar with the keys. The slight stiffness started to fade, replaced by a gentle flow. Her breathing slowed down, and the noise of her thoughts began to quiet. Another note, then another. The melody grew just a little stronger. A woman near the window looked toward the piano. She hadn't planned to, but something about the sound pulled her attention. She watched for a moment, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to quiet interest. Hannah still didn't look up. She was no longer thinking about the people in the room, or the manager watching from a distance, or the risk she had taken by sitting here. All of that had begun to fade into the background. All that remained was the music. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer just careful but confident in a quiet way. The melody began to change, slowly building into something deeper. It was still soft, still gentle, but it carried more emotion with it. It wasn't just background music anymore. It was a voice, a memory, a feeling that had been locked away for a long time. At another table, a guest who had been checking his phone looked up. He frowned slightly, as if trying to understand what was different. Then he placed his phone down without thinking and listened. The room was changing. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, like a shift in the air that people could feel even if they didn't notice it right away. Hannah's shoulders relaxed slightly. Her hands no longer trembled. She let the melody guide her. It reminded her of those quiet mornings long ago, when she would sit by the piano near the window. Back then, she had played without fear, without pressure. She had played because she loved it. For the first time in years, that feeling returned. Her fingers pressed the keys with more purpose now, creating a sound that carried both softness and strength. The notes rose and fell like a gentle wave, touching something inside the people listening. At the back of the room, the manager stood still, watching. At first, he had only been concerned about keeping the atmosphere from falling apart. He hadn't expected much from Hannah, just enough to fill the silence until the backup arrived. But now his expression had changed. He wasn't thinking about the problem anymore. He was listening. The melody shifted again, becoming slightly more emotional. It wasn't loud, but it held a quiet intensity that made it hard to ignore. Conversations around the room began to slow down, voices becoming softer as more people noticed the music. Hannah didn't rush. She let each note settle before moving to the next. It was as if she was telling a story, one that didn't need words. A story of something lost, something remembered, something still alive beneath the surface. At a table near the piano, a guest leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Hannah's hands. There was a slight look of surprise on his face. He had seen many performances in places like this, but this felt different, felt honest. Hannah's expression remained calm, but inside, something was unfolding. The fear that had been there earlier was almost gone now. In its place was something deeper, connection. She wasn't playing for the guests anymore. She was playing because she needed to, because the music had been waiting inside her, quiet and patient, for a long time. And now it was finally being heard again. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, weaving notes together in a way that felt natural, like she had never stopped. The melody expanded, reaching further into the room, touching more ears, more hearts. A woman at one of the corner tables placed her hand gently on the table, her attention fully on the piano now. She didn't speak. She simply listened. Even the staff began to slow their movements. Sora stood near the service station, her eyes wide, completely focused on Hannah. She had never seen this side of her before. It was like watching a different person, someone she didn't know existed. Hannah continued playing. The music carried a quiet rise now, building slowly but steadily. It wasn't dramatic, not overwhelming, but it held a strength that grew with each passing moment. It filled the space in a way that felt natural, like it belonged there all along. The room was no longer just a place for meals and conversations. It had become something else. A place where people were listening, really listening. Hannah took a soft breath as her fingers moved into the next part of the melody. Her eyes stayed on the keys, but her mind was clear. There was no doubt anymore, no hesitation, only the music. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like herself again. The notes flowed smoothly, one after another, creating something that felt complete, even though it was still unfolding. At that moment, it didn't matter who was watching. It didn't matter what would happen next. All that mattered was this moment, this sound, this quiet return to something she had thought was gone forever. And as the melody continued to grow, the room followed it, drawn in completely, without even realizing how deeply it had already changed them. The music continued to flow through the room, soft but steady, like a quiet story being told without words. By now, almost everyone in the restaurant had noticed. Conversations had slowed, and in some places they had completely stopped. The gentle sound of plates and glasses had faded into the background. The piano had become the center of everything. Hannah's fingers moved with ease, but inside, something deeper was beginning to rise. Each note she played seemed to unlock something she had kept hidden for years. First, it was just a feeling, a small pull inside her chest. But as the melody continued, that feeling grew stronger, turning into memories she could no longer ignore. She remembered the old piano from her childhood. It wasn't as beautiful as this one. It had small scratches on the surface, and one of the keys made a slightly dull sound. But to her, it had been perfect. She could still picture it clearly, the way the sunlight would fall across it in the morning, the way the room would fill with quiet warmth as she practiced. She had spent hours there. Sometimes her fingers would ache, sometimes she would make mistakes again and again, but she never gave up. There was a simple joy in learning each note, in slowly getting better, in feeling the music become part of her. Hannah's hands continued moving over the keys in the present, but her heart had gone back to those days. She remembered a voice, calm and patient. "Don't rush," the voice would say. "Let the music breathe." Her fingers softened slightly, following that memory without even thinking. The notes became more gentle, more open, as if they were given space to exist. At a nearby table, an older guest closed his eyes for a moment, listening closely. There was something familiar in the way she played. Not in the exact melody, but in the feeling behind it. Hannah took a quiet breath. Another memory surfaced. Late evenings, when the room was dim and the world outside was quiet. She would sit at the piano, playing softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Those were the moments she felt most at peace. She didn't play for anyone else. She played for herself. For a long time she had forgotten that feeling. But now, sitting here, it was coming back. Her fingers pressed down more firmly, adding a slight depth to the sound. The melody began to shift again, carrying a mix of calm and something heavier underneath. There had been difficult days too. Days when practicing felt impossible. Days when life outside the music demanded more than she could give. Hannah's expression remained calm, but her eyes held something deeper now. She remembered the moment everything changed. A quiet conversation. A decision that didn't feel like a choice. The piano had stood there, just like always, but something inside her had already begun to let go. She had told herself it was only for a short time, just until things became easier, but they never did. Her fingers slowed for a brief moment, as if holding onto that memory. Then they moved again. The sound that followed carried something new, a quiet sadness, not loud, not overwhelming, but real. The kind of feeling that didn't need to be explained. Across the room, a woman sitting alone near the window lowered her gaze slightly. She didn't know why, but the music made her think of something she hadn't thought about in a long time. The restaurant felt different now. It was no longer just a place filled with people enjoying a meal. It had become a space where emotions moved quietly between strangers, connected by the same sound. Hannah's hands continued, steady but expressive. She remembered the day she stopped playing, the silence that followed. At first, it had felt strange, like something was missing. Then slowly she got used to it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The piano became something distant, like a dream she once had. She told herself it was fine, that she didn't need it anymore. But deep down, something had always stayed. Something quiet, something patient, waiting. Her fingers pressed the keys with a little more strength now, and the melody responded, growing fuller. The sound carried both the past and the present, blending them together in a way that felt honest. At the back of the room, the manager still stood watching. But now there was no worry in his face, only quiet surprise. He had seen many performers, many musicians who played perfectly, without mistakes. But this was different. This wasn't about perfection. This was about truth. Hannah leaned slightly forward, completely lost in the music now. The world around her had faded. There were no guests, no expectations, no pressure. Only the piano, only the sound, only the feeling that had finally found its way back. Her fingers moved into a softer part of the melody, almost like a whisper. It was gentle, careful, like holding something fragile. She thought about the years that had passed, the long days of work, the quiet nights, the times she had almost forgotten who she used to be. And yet, here she was, still able to play, still able to feel, still able to bring that part of herself back to life. The realization settled inside her quietly, but it changed something. Her shoulders relaxed even more. Her breathing became steady. There was no fear left now. Only acceptance. Only connection. The melody began to rise again, slowly building from that soft moment into something a little stronger. Not loud, not overwhelming. Just enough to show that the story wasn't only about loss. It was also about holding on. About something that never fully disappeared. At one of the tables, a guest who had been silent for a long time finally spoke in a low voice. "She's not just playing," he said. "She's remembering." No one replied, but the people at the table understood. They could hear it too. Hannah's fingers moved with quiet confidence, guiding the music forward. Each note carried a part of her journey. Each sound filled the space with something real. And as the melody continued to unfold, it became clear to everyone listening that this was not just a performance. It was a story of something left behind, a story of something found again, a story that didn't need words because the music was saying everything. Hannah didn't know how long she had been playing. Time felt different now, slower, softer, like it had stepped aside to let this moment exist. Her hands moved into the next part of the melody, preparing for something more. Something that would carry everything she had felt so far into one final expression. But for now, she stayed in this space. This quiet, honest moment, where the past and present met, where the music spoke, and where she, without even realizing it, had begun to become whole again. The melody did not stop. It continued to grow, slowly at first, then with more strength, like a quiet voice finally becoming clear. Hannah's fingers moved with purpose now, no longer careful or unsure. Every note she played carried meaning, and that meaning spread across the room in a way no one expected when the night began. The soft part of the music began to shift. The gentle tone she had been holding started to rise, becoming fuller, deeper. It was still controlled, still graceful, but there was something stronger behind it now. Something that could not be hidden anymore. Hannah leaned forward slightly, her eyes still on the keys, her breathing steady. This was the part she didn't plan. She hadn't meant to go this far. But the music had taken her here on its own. At one of the tables near the center, a guest slowly placed his glass down without making a sound. His attention was fully on the piano now. Around him, others had done the same. Conversations had almost completely disappeared. The room, once filled with quiet talk and movement, was now still. Only the music remained. Hannah's hands moved faster, but not in a rushed way. Each note connected smoothly to the next, creating a sound that felt alive. The melody carried both light and weight, like it was holding two feelings at once. There was strength in it now. Not loud strength, but steady strength. The kind that comes from holding on for a long time. At the back of the room, Sora stood frozen, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. She had forgotten about everything else. The orders, the guests, even her own work. She was watching Hannah with wide eyes, unable to look away. "This is her?" she whispered under her breath. The manager didn't respond. He couldn't. His attention was fixed on the piano just like everyone else. Hannah moved into a higher range on the keys, and the sound lifted with her. It felt like the music was opening up, reaching outward, filling every corner of the room. The notes were no longer just telling a quiet story. They were expressing something bigger, something that had been building inside her for years. Her fingers pressed firmly, then softened, then rose again in a steady rhythm that carried emotion with it. It was not perfect in a technical way, but it didn't need to be. It was real. At a table near the window, the woman who had been listening quietly earlier now had her hands folded in front of her. Her eyes were slightly glassy, though she didn't fully understand why. The music had touched something personal, something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Hannah didn't see any of it. She was completely inside the moment. Her thoughts were no longer separate from her hands. Everything was connected now. The past she had remembered, the present she was living, and the sound she was creating. The melody rose again, stronger this time. There was no hesitation, no fear, only expression. She was no longer the waitress trying to fill a silence. She was someone who had something to say. And the room was listening. A man sitting near the front leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on her hands. He had attended many events, heard many musicians, but this felt different. There was something honest here, something that couldn't be practiced or copied, could only be lived. Hannah's fingers moved into a fast sequence, not flashy, but powerful in its rhythm. The sound carried energy now, a quiet intensity that held everyone's attention. The air in the room felt heavier, but not in a bad way. Felt full of something shared. The music slowed for a brief moment, as if taking a breath. Then it rose again. This time it reached its highest point. Hannah pressed the keys with a strength that surprised even herself. The sound that came out was clear, bold, and full of feeling. It carried everything she had held inside. The years of silence, the memories, the quiet strength she had built without realizing it. It was all there, nothing hidden, nothing held back. The room felt completely still. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the small sounds of the restaurant had disappeared. It was as if time had paused just for this moment. Hannah's hands began to slow again, guiding the melody toward its end. The strong notes softened. The rhythm became gentle once more. Felt like a quiet return after a long journey. Her fingers moved with care, each note placed exactly where it needed to be. The final part of the melody was simple, but it carried everything. She pressed the last few notes softly, letting them fade into the air. And then, silence. Real silence. Not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels full. Hannah's hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, as if she was not ready to let go. Her breathing was calm, but her heart was still moving quickly beneath it. She slowly lifted her fingers. The room stayed quiet. For a brief second, it felt like no one knew what to do. Then, somewhere near the back, a single sound broke the silence. A clap. It was soft, but clear. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire room began to respond. Applause filled the space, rising quickly, growing louder with each second. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't forced. It was real. People stood up, one after another, their hands coming together with genuine feeling. The sound of it filled the restaurant completely, echoing off the walls, carrying something warm and strong. The elite crowd, the same people who had barely noticed her before, were now on their feet. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Hannah sat still for a moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She looked up slowly. What she saw surprised her. People were standing. All of them. Their faces showed something she hadn't expected, respect. Some smiled. Some simply watched her quietly. But all of them were present in that moment. The applause continued. Hannah felt a small shift inside her chest. Something soft and unfamiliar. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being seen. For a second, she didn't know how to react. Then she lowered her head slightly. A quiet and natural gesture. Not a performance. Just herself. The applause didn't stop right away. It carried on, filling the room with a warmth that stayed even after the sound began to fade. At the side of the room, the manager finally let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked at Hannah with a completely different expression now. Not as an employee, but as someone he had clearly underestimated. Sora wiped her hands quickly on her apron, still staring. "I didn't know," she said softly. No one had known. Not until now. Hannah slowly stood up from the piano bench. Her movements were calm, simple, the same as always. But something had changed, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. As the last of the applause faded, the room remained different. Quieter, softer, like something meaningful had just passed through it and left its mark behind. Hannah took a small step back from the piano. For a brief moment, she looked at it again. Not as something distant, not as something lost, but as something that was still part of her. Something that had never really gone away. And now everyone in that room knew it too. The sound of applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind stayed in the room. It was not the same restaurant anymore, even though nothing around had physically changed. The lights were still soft, the tables still full, and the night still ongoing. But something deeper had shifted. Hannah stood beside the piano, her hands resting gently by her sides. For a moment she didn't move. She wasn't frozen, just still, as if she needed a second to understand what had just happened. She had only meant to help. Just simple music. Just something to fill the silence. But it had become something else entirely. A few guests were still standing. Some had slowly returned to their seats, but their attention had not fully moved away from her. There was a quiet respect in their expressions now, something that hadn't been there before. Hannah gave a small, natural bow again, not too deep, not too formal. It was simple, just like her. Then she stepped back from the piano. For a second, she thought about returning to her usual work right away. Picking up a tray, moving between tables, becoming invisible again. That had been her routine for so long. But before she could take another step, someone approached her. It was an older man from one of the central tables. His posture was calm, his expression thoughtful. He didn't rush, didn't speak loudly. He simply walked up and stopped a short distance from her. "That was honest," he said. His voice was quiet, but clear. Hannah looked at him, slightly unsure how to respond. "Thank you." He nodded once, as if that was enough. "You didn't just play," he continued. "You shared something." Hannah didn't answer right away. She wasn't used to hearing words like that directed at her. "I used to hear many performances," the man added. "Perfect ones. But tonight felt real." Hannah lowered her gaze slightly. "I haven't played in a long time." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small, understanding smile. "Sometimes time doesn't take things away. It only hides them." With that, he stepped back, giving her a respectful nod before returning to his table. Hannah watched him go, his words staying with her. Before she could think further, another guest approached. Then another. Not all of them spoke much. Some simply nodded. Some offered a quiet, "well done." Others just gave her a look that said enough without words. It wasn't overwhelming. It was calm. But it was real. At the side of the room, Sora finally rushed over, her face full of excitement and disbelief. "Hannah, what was that?" she said, her voice barely controlled. Hannah blinked slightly. "I just played." "No." Sora shook her head quickly. "That was not just played. That was, I don't even know how to say it." Hannah gave a small, unsure smile. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sora asked. Hannah paused. It didn't feel important. Sora stared at her for a second. "Not important? You just made an entire room stop talking." Hannah didn't know what to say to that. Before the moment could continue, the manager approached. His steps were slower than usual, his expression serious but not in a harsh way. "Hannah," he said. She straightened slightly. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "You should have told me," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was something else. Hannah lowered her head slightly. "I'm sorry." The manager shook his head gently. "No, not that." He looked toward the piano, then back at her. "I didn't know," he admitted. Another pause followed. Then quietly he added, "That was more than I expected." Hannah nodded slightly, unsure how to respond again. The manager took a breath. "Go take a short break." She blinked. "But the tables." "I'll handle it," he said. "Just for a few minutes." Hannah hesitated. Breaks were not something she usually took in the middle of a busy shift. But something in his tone told her it was not a suggestion. "Okay," she said softly. She stepped away from the main floor, moving toward a quieter corner near the back. The sounds of the restaurant slowly returned behind her. Soft conversations, gentle movement. But they still carried a different tone now. She found a small empty space near a window and stopped there. For the first time since she had sat at the piano, she allowed herself to breathe fully. A slow breath in, then out. Her hands still felt warm, not tired, just awake. She looked down at them for a moment. These same hands had carried trays, cleaned tables, worked long hours without pause. And yet, they had just created something that changed an entire room. The thought felt strange, almost unreal. She leaned slightly against the wall, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the night was calm, the city lights soft in the distance. Everything looked normal, but she didn't feel the same. Something inside her had shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way, like something that had been closed for a long time had finally opened again. She thought about the piano, about the feeling of the keys under her fingers, about the sound that had filled the room, and for the first time in years the thought didn't feel distant. Felt close, possible. A small voice inside her, one she had ignored for a long time, spoke again. Not loudly, just clearly. You didn't lose it. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. When she returned to the main floor, things had settled into a new rhythm. Guests were still talking, still eating, but there was a softer energy now. A few people glanced at her as she walked by, recognizing her in a way they hadn't before. She picked up a tray again. Her steps were the same. Her movements were the same, but her presence felt different. Not because she tried to change it, but because something inside her had already changed. As she moved between tables, the manager passed by her once more. "We may need you again," he said quietly. Hannah looked at him. "Not tonight," he added, "but soon." She gave a small nod. "I understand." He paused for a moment, then continued on. The rest of the night passed more smoothly. The backup pianist eventually arrived, taking his place at the piano. He played well, technically perfect, just as expected. But even so, something from earlier still lingered in the room. Something that couldn't be replaced. Hannah didn't stop to listen this time. She continued her work. But every now and then, her fingers would move slightly at her side, as if remembering, as if waiting. When the night finally came to an end, the guests slowly left, one by one. The lights dimmed slightly, and the quiet calm of closing time settled in. Hannah finished her tasks, cleaned her area, and removed her apron. Before leaving, she paused for a moment. Her eyes moved toward the piano again. Stood there, quiet and still just like before. But now it didn't feel distant. Felt like something she could walk toward again. Not as a memory, but as a part of her life. She didn't walk over to it this time. Not yet. But she didn't look away quickly either. She simply stood there for a moment, letting the feeling settle. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool and fresh. She stepped into the night, her pace calm and steady. There was no sudden decision, no dramatic change, just a quiet understanding. Something had begun again, and this time she wasn't going to leave it behind so easily.